Hey guys, my name is Kelsey. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are bringing the mood down a little and talking about my least favorite books of 2018. I had a pretty good reading year, a total of 68 books, and I think these are all 2 out of 5 stars. I didn't have any 1-star reads this year, which is pretty successful for me. I did have 4 books I DNF'd, and I'll just briefly cover those. The first, it was Final Draft by Riley Redgate. I listened to this on audiobook and I just wasn't feeling the story, so I stopped about 10% in. The second I DNF'd is The Wolf by Leo Carew. I got this in a subscription box and the story just wasn't for me. It was super intense fantasy, very political, strategy based, and I just wasn't into it at all. I got halfway through and decided that it was never going to be for me. The third was Escaping Indigo by Eli Lang. I picked this up at the library and got like 3 pages in before I DNF'd because it was full of run-on sentences and I just couldn't handle it. And the last was In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, and I DNF'd this because it was boring. I know it's a classic, but I just couldn't deal. Okay, let's get into the books I rated. I'm going to try to keep this brief. I don't want to rant about anything, so here we go. The first is Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. I don't have a lot to say about this because I'm not a huge poetry reader. I'm not a big critic or anything, and I always feel bad reading poetry because it's so personal to the author. But I gave it 2 stars because I thought it was a little boring. None of the poems were very impactful. Nothing resonated with me. There were a few standouts, but overall, I wasn't impressed. Next is You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero. This book started off rough for me, because within the first chapter they bring up God, as in the Christian God, and I'm not a religious person. She does say that you can replace her God with whichever God or spiritual divine being works for you, but once you know she's writing from the perspective of Christianity, it's hard to get that out of your head. Now, the advice in this book was just not practical. There's a lot of like, just put yourself out there. Just do what you love and things will come to you. And that's just not real advice. It's kind of a cop-out, honestly. There are 2 points in this book that really stuck with me as terrible things to say to someone. The first was when she brings up depression, and she basically says to get over it. She says you just need to get out and do things and then you'll feel better. But that's really not how depression works, and I didn't like that depiction of it. The second point was when she basically advocates for making poor financial decisions with the idea that everything works out in the end anyways, which again is terrible advice. Overall, this was just not impressive. I don't know why it's lauded as this amazing, super inspirational self-help book, but there are definitely better books out there. Next up is a fairly unpopular opinion, and that is Eliza and Her Monsters by Francesca Zappia. I read this towards the beginning of the year, so I don't remember a ton about the story, but I do remember that it really bothered me the way our lead character, Eliza, talked about and thought about and treated her family. She didn't seem to be self-aware in any way. I mean, I remember being a teenager, and I definitely lashed out at my family. When I thought back on those moments, I knew I was being irrational. I knew I was being mean for no reason, and Eliza never has those realizations for herself. I thought it was a little unrealistic, and Eliza is 18 in this book, which seems a little old to not be thinking about the way you're behaving to other people. Next up is Bored and Brilliant by, I think it's Manoush Zomorodi. I don't have a physical copy of the book. This was supposed to be a book that helps you be bored, basically. To get off your phone, to let yourself wander, to let your mind wander. And it did that, but it didn't need to be a book. I mean, it was basically a 7-step program for how to let your phone go, and the extra information was unnecessary, so reading the whole book was kind of boring. Next up is another unpopular opinion. I already unhauled this book, Dress Codes for Small Towns by Courtney C. Stevens. Overall, I just thought this book was kind of boring. It's definitely a slice of life style following what should have been very interesting for me, a genderqueer girl in a small town who's the son of a pastor. But there really is no plot, or the plot is very thin. Definitely focused on character growth. If you're into that kind of book, you might still want to check it out. The characters were definitely interesting, but the whole book itself was very long and just boring for me. Okay, I'm really on a roll with the unpopular opinions because next up is They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. I was anticipating this book because I loved More Happy Than Not. I actually bought the ebook and loved it so much that I went out and got a physical copy. So when They Both Die at the End came out, I was excited to pick it up. They Both Die at the End is about a future society where people get a call from this service called Deathcast on the day that they're going to die. And that's what happens to our main two characters. They both get the call and they meet through this app called Friend Finder so that they have someone to spend their last day with. And my biggest problem with the book was this service, Deathcast, because it doesn't make any sense. And I'm a big sci-fi fantasy reader, so for this kind of thing to be in a book and not have it make any sense was just frustrating the whole time. There were so many things that would not have happened if they had never gotten a call from Deathcast, which means everything would have been different and they might not have died. I found the whole premise very confusing and it wasn't explained at all. My other issue were the characters. I liked Mateo. I connected with him. I thought his character was pretty well built, but I had trouble with Rufus. I thought he was really inconsistent, his characterization, and I didn't feel like their personalities would have connected this quickly. It was just a really disappointing read for me overall. Next up is An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. I think this book just wasn't for me. It's a contemporary literary fiction about a recently married couple, and the man is falsely imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, and it follows them after that happens in their relationship and their families and growth. I picked this up because it filled a challenge for the Book Riot Read Harder challenge of Read an Oprah Book Club pick. The writing was definitely great. It was beautifully written, easy to follow, easy to understand. The conversations felt very natural. I just wasn't interested in the plot. Next up is Mem by Brittany C. Morrow. This is an alternate history set in the 20s where a service to extract memories has become popular. Negative memories or stressful memories, people can just extract them and get rid of them so they don't have to think about them anymore. Generally, these extracted memories or mems just exist in a cycle over and over. They don't have personalities, they don't live, they don't react to outside forces, except for our main character, who is her own person, who can make new memories, who can interact with people. And I love the premise of this book. It sounded so good, and the first 75% of it I was really interested in, but I was very disappointed in the ending. It felt like such a weird way to go for such a potentially impactful book. And that's all I'll say about that. Next up is Beacon 23 by Hugh Howey. This is a sci-fi book set in these beacons, and beacons are like the lighthouses of space, which is a very cool idea, and I was very excited to read about that. But it's very short, and our main character is underdeveloped, and overall the story was kind of underwhelming. I was a little confused a lot of the time, which might be the point. You're not really supposed to know what's real and what's not. This is a lonely guy who works alone on a remote station in the middle of nowhere, so it kind of follows his inner thoughts, his development throughout this time. It was just underwhelming. Next up is Brave Enough by Katie Gardner. This was a total cover buy because I think it's beautiful. It's about a teenage ballerina. She is the youngest ballerina at the Atlanta Ballet Conservatory. Her mother is a famous ballerina, so she's been doing ballet her entire life. And one day she finds out that an injury she's been trying to cope with is much more serious than she anticipated. Our second main character is a boy, Davis, who's gotten in trouble for drugs in the past, and as punishment is sent to volunteer at this oncology unit where he was previously a patient. It follows these two characters and the way their lives intertwine, and it covers some really serious and heavy topics, but I didn't connect with any of the characters, and there was some really interesting things going on with the relationship between Kaysen, the ballerina, and her mother that I think could have been explored a lot more and were more interesting than her relationship with this boy, Davis. So yeah, just underwhelming again. Okay, and finishing up with another unpopular opinion, The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. I have seen hype for this all over the place. I follow a lot of other booktubers on Twitter and they rave about this book. I've seen a lot of positive reviews about it. The ebook was available from my library, so I picked it up on a whim. And one thing I will say for it is that I read it in one day. The writing style was super addicting and super easy to read, so I just sped through it. My first problem with this book was the world building. I haven't read any other fairy books. I don't know anything about fairy lore, and I feel like it was kind of a prerequisite for going into this book because I was confused about the world for at least the first third. It wasn't well described. There were a lot of things I didn't understand until after they had happened. At one point, the main character gets on a giant frog, like it's a horse, to ride it somewhere, which was super confusing because there had been no mention of other magical creatures at this point. I see a lot of people say that Jude is like super badass, super brutal, but I really didn't think so. Most of her time is spent thinking about how she wants to be a badass and not actually doing anything about it. And finally, Cardan, our main love interest, or at least that's what the book implies, he will be a future love interest, is the title character, the Cruel Prince, but he's not cruel enough to justify that title. He's just kind of a dick, and his friends are way more cruel than he is. He has no personality that we're able to see except this weird defensiveness and family interactions. Honestly, the most interesting thing about Cardan is that he has a tail. There were a lot of questionable things that the main character does, and he has no redeeming qualities to justify his behavior. Not that anything could justify some of the things he does, but there's nothing to make me like him for being such a dick. Obviously, I don't plan on continuing the series, but if I'm bored and it's at the library, I might hate read it. Alright, that's it for my least favorite books of 2018. Let me know in the comments if you also hated any of these books or if you loved them and now you hate me. I promise I'd love to hear from you either way. If you like this video, hit like down below. If you want to see more, subscribe. I upload book-related videos every Wednesday, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!